Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Annabelle Baldy from BioBuzz, and I'm super excited to have you guys all here for another one of our Career Catalyst sessions, which are part of our ongoing Career Catalyst and Community Office Hours series. So we do these every single Tuesday, and these sessions are designed to help connect you directly with industry insiders to kind of help share some of those practical insights to help you move you forward in your career. And today, we're going to be exploring how to kind of think a little bit differently about your career path. So moving beyond the idea of this simple career ladder and seeing it more as a connected system of experiences. So we have Dr. Michael Nestor that's going to be sharing how the systems thinking approach can reveal some new opportunities for growth, adaptability, and innovation, especially looking at kind of how AI is reshaping, many different industries, particularly life science. So very excited, like I said, to welcome Dr. Michael Nestor, Board of Directors of the Government University Industry Philanthropy Research Roundtable at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So a little bit more about Dr. Nestor. He's built an incredible career spanning neuroscience, research, federal policy, venture advising, and biotech entrepreneurship. His work has helped to shape the nation's innovation ecosystem, from pioneering the brain organoid and CRISPR-based autism research to helping to launch the Washington, D.C. JLab site through Johnson & Johnson Innovation. And his research has also led to two biotechnology spinouts, so Utica Bio, as well as Synaptisem, where he now serves as the Chief Scientific Officer. So want to thank him for coming on today. And before we do get started, I want to also give a big thank you to our sponsor for today's session, BioTrack. You guys can check them out at biotrack.com, but they are a great resource for upskilling in the life sciences. So definitely go on, look at them. They've trained over 17,000 scientists, and like I said, great resource. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you, Annabelle, for the nice introduction, and thank you for everybody for being here online, and I look forward to a robust conversation after this presentation as well. So, I come to this conversation, I don't want to slam you with a ton of slides, and I come to this conversation also not claiming to be a career guru that's going to give you some, definitive answer. What I'm hoping to do is give you some information about how I think about careers, especially now that we are in a new era. Every single title from here on out for these should include AI, because that's really where we're at. And the hope is that by talking you through a systems thinking approach, which is how I've treated my own scientific career, both in the lab and outside the lab, that it'll spark you to maybe take a look at your own career journey and maybe give you some answers to help you along with your career journey. So today we're going to look at that systems thinking, and we're really going to look at this framework that I learned a lot from studying complex biological networks. And then later on had my own aha moment where I said, I am literally a complex biological network. So why am I not applying what I'm learning in the lab to my own career? And I think it can help scientists in particular, because this type of thinking, we're often trained in this thinking. We just don't even know that we are. And so the question is, how do you synthesize that systems thinking with AI to enhance your career journey, especially right now? And I recognize at the front of this that this is a really challenging time for a lot of folks in science. So the other hope here is that you'll find some information that may help you in your immediate search as well. So just take a couple sentences. Annabelle did a nice job introducing me. I've lived my career at the intersection between biotech and academia. That was of necessity, because when I first started in a traditional academic track, like many of you, I was pivoted at a very early stage to wanting to study human stem cells, because I was at the time I was at the National Institutes of Health as a postdoc, And you couldn't actually do human stem cell research at the time. It was in a little bit of a gray zone. And that wasn't that long ago. So it shows you how quickly these fields can change. But because of that, I had to step out of a traditional path in academic science to do a path that sort of necessitated these sort of movements across sectors. So I would say as much of my journey is me making conscious choices because I had to, it's also because as I got further into this this career that really was pulling these different segments together, I realized that that career arc, that career journey, is really part of who I am as a person. I do like to push the boundaries, and I do like to live cross-sectorally. So I think that's the most important thing I'll say at the very beginning that you've probably heard before in these types of talks, but know thyself. I think it's really important to know who you are, what your values are, and what environments you work well in, and more importantly, what environments you don't work well in. So that, with that said, let's jump into the substance of this, and then we'll get into the Q&A. But I don't have to tell most folks here that we've moved beyond scientific careers as a linear path. And so, all right, so I don't need to tell most folks here that we're in a new era, and this is really not new. It's been happening for the last 10 to 15 years. One of the things that I looked at when I got my first PhD and I thought about going on a traditional tenure track model was, I looked at this, and we're shifting scientific careers, but most accelerated in the last 5 years from traditional hierarchies to more network and team-based models, from looking at scientists as subject matter experts, although you do have to have that background, to folks that can do more synthesizing and putting together complex ideas. And we're moving from a top-down control model to a more connection model. The idea that you're the center of a hub is going away, and that you're more connected with other folks. And so I think thinking through what that means for you personally, but also I think institutions need to do a better job of thinking that, we do have layers of management in institutions right now that are still in that hierarchy, expertise, and control domain, and they need to be in the network synthesis and connection domain. So this is as much for you as it is for institutions. But only 29% of PhD holders right now at this point are in tenure track positions. So the majority of folks hold hybrid roles spanning academia, government, nonprofits, and startups. So although maybe 5-7 years ago my career would look unique, it doesn't look so unique now. And so this diversification has created a labor market where I think cross-sector mobility is actually the norm rather than the exception, though most of us think that we need to have a linear progression through our career path. And I think that is one of the things I'd like to challenge your thinking on today. All right, let's make sure this advances correctly. And it's not advancing correctly. There we go. Okay. So the system thinking lens. So what is systems thinking, and why is it important in all of this era in which we're moving to this more connected, more diversified career path? Well, it really focuses less on how parts interact to produce a linear progression, but more how the parts of your career interact to produce behavior that can't be explained by the parts alone. And that's really important. So when it applies to careers, it really asks you to ask, how do my experiences interact with one another? What feedback do they generate, not for me only, but also externally for my story? And then what is my larger pattern? So the idea is that you don't necessarily have to start, for example, when I started, it was postdoc, then staff scientist, then I ran my own lab as a PI. Those are very linear progressions. This is how we were mostly trained as scientists. However, it doesn't mean that that progression is the only way. So for example, you could start out as a postdoc and then move to a completely different area and maybe work in sales, and then come back to the bench and do something, for example, in a more traditional academic setting. The question is, for you and for the folks that are looking at your career as you're applying for new jobs, what is the story arc there? How do those experiences interact, and what feedback for those folks that you're talking about when you're applying to jobs, what feedback can you give to them based on what would look like we would consider a nonlinear move? And the OECD, sorry, really calls this movement in careers the rise of systems literacy. So it's the ability to see connections. So in my case, policy, innovation, workforce systems. So when I was at NIH, couldn't do stem cell research. Automatically, I started to get pulled into policy, whether I liked it or not. I had to understand why that was happening at a government lab. What does that mean for research? So scientists who cultivate this literacy, this systems literacy, are better able to navigate the change, and we're going to have a lot of it, and design more sustainable professional ecosystems. One thing I'd also like to challenge you on is the idea that what is the nature of what does it mean to be a scientist? I think oftentimes we have a vision in our mind that's very trained by our societal norms and cultures. And I think that the idea of a scientist is sort of a singular individual that's doing something at the bench is part of the idea of systems literacy, blowing that idea up and rethinking what a scientist means. Being a scientist also can mean contributing to the larger society in terms of policy or ethics or many, many other types of careers that aren't necessarily a white coat and a bench. All right, so
Michael, I apologize.
Now I understand what I have to do. I have to click and then I have to click. So we've got it. So, so let's think about fragmented careers as systems, because the median tenure for private sector biotech right now is about 3.5 years. So that means that a typical research from here on out is going to move through multiple roles across funding cycles. I think the idea of these 20 or 30-year careers in a single place with linear progression is coming to an end. So each position, each grant, each collaboration becomes a data point in that larger system that you're building. So seen individually or even as a series of roles, these fragments can look chaotic. And I think viewed collectively, though, and using a systems overview, they can reveal recurring themes that you can talk about in your story arc, like translation or mentoring or commercialization. So you see yourself as a scientist doing many, many different tasks. So that recognition, seeing coherence across the fragments, seeing coherence across the roles, is really the first act of systems thinking when applied to a career. All right. So what does that really mean? So let's think about careers in terms of career systems loops. So inputs, interactions, outcomes, and feedback. So this is what a recursive system would look like oftentimes in biology. And a career behaves like that. In many ways, we've actually operationalized and systematized careers, which are a function of biological activity, our mental states, our emotional states, our behavior. These are all biological activities. We've overlaid a digital, I should say, onto an analog. What do I mean by that? So we're taking biology, in some ways messy biology, which is our behavior, our emotions, our thoughts, and we're trying to systematize that and operationalize that. And so it's no wonder that people often feel very disconnected from their career search. And so what does that mean? So if you treat your career more like an adaptive system and you think about it more like your own biology, then you think about things like your inputs, right? That's your education, that's your skills, that's your networks. We're really not talking about that today. That's in some ways, I think, pretty straightforward. But then the next layer, which becomes a little bit more challenging, is what are your interactions, your collaborations, your mentors, your network? But what are your interactions with institutions? And you'll see where I'm going with this in a little bit. Of course, you've got outcomes, another easy measurable task, right? So papers, products, programs, that's the stuff that they tell you, on your CV, you want to quantify those data points. You want to make sure that you've got actionable items. That's easy. Outcomes are also easy. And of course, feedback. So what does that mean? So there's different layers of feedback. And I think as scientists, we're really trained to think about things like citations or funding success or, how many grants that you got. as a metric of feedback, and that's all important. But what I'm challenging you on today is think a little bit more deeply about how do you talk about feedback, or the feedback you can give to an employer that involves something like personal satisfaction. So what is your personal satisfaction with the environment and the institution that you're in? Can you measure impact? What is the impact of your work, and what does it mean to measure impact? Impact is easily measured through citations and funding success, but I think as you're sitting in an interview or you're talking about a new role, speaking about impact in terms of how you influenced changes in an organization or how you influence a new way of thinking, that is the type of thing that requires that systematized thinking that's going to tell a compelling story and get people to realize your value. Because I say all of this to remind you that you have intrinsic value. It's very important to these organizations to bring that value into their network, but they won't recognize it unless you frame it in a way that's authentic to you. And so I think thinking about the impact, personal satisfaction, these deeper psychological questions, and systematizing them and talking about them in a way that can be translated in an interview is equally as important as saying, I have X number of citations, or we got Y grant, or I increased my budget by 7% this year. If you can meld those two together, again, systems thinking, then you've created a really powerful picture of who you are and what you're bringing to that organization. And the truth is that, again, going back to OECD statistics, so they have an STI, this is an innovation outlook. They note in that 68% of our major innovations arise from collaborations linking at least two disparate scientific sectors. So it's not just something I'm telling you, it's something that actually happens. So if you want to be seen as an innovator, you can be an innovator within your own career. You can demonstrate that innovation by linking things for folks, from telling, like I said, telling that story between impact and citations, not just citations or just impact. And that same pattern holds in career. Scientists who move between domains, according to the Harvard Business Review, it came out in 2023, said that those scientists generate higher innovation output and have higher satisfaction with their jobs. So moving between domains and forcing yourself into this uncomfortable environment of constant synthesis, actually, I guess the way I like to think about it is being comfortable with being uncomfortable actually creates an environment in which you will be seen as somebody who can generate innovation and an essential team member. All right, so let's talk about emergence and coherence, because this is a really important piece of the system thinking. So coherence is really what you're looking for. And this is very easily demonstrated when you think about something like light, right? So you can see your career as a series of choices that sometimes have an incoherent move to them. So maybe you started out in one domain and then you did a career shift and you moved to another domain. But this filter, this wavelength filter in the slide that I'm showing you, is essentially the idea of thinking about your career as emergent properties. So what does that mean by emergent properties? So in systems biology, memory, for example, and regulation emerge from simpler activities. Like, so for example, I'm a neuroscientist. I didn't even mention that at the beginning. Notice that I didn't mention that at the beginning, by the way, and that was on purpose, because I didn't define myself, and that's part of what I'm trying to sort of get through too. Is you don't have to start with, I'm a neuroscientist, I went to this university, this is my degree. You need to talk about yourself as a holistic bridge builder. Anyway, to come back to this part of the conversation, in systems biology, when you have something like an emergent property, you can have the firing of neurons happening at the cellular level. You can have molecular interactions happening even deeper than that. You have genetics and environment. But if you study any one of those things, which we essentially call a reductionist type approach, you may not be able to understand that the higher level phenomenon. So that is the classic debate between functionalism and reductionism in neuroscience. Do you care about the circuit, or do you care about the individual spiking of the individual neurons? Well, the argument is it's both, actually. So you have to understand these bottom line ideas and experiences, but you have to also understand that from all of these bottom line ideas and experiences emerges something that couldn't have existed without the synthesis of all of those. And so what do I mean more concretely? So in professional life, in our professional lives, meaning, What is meaning? Meaning is something that emerges from connected experiences. Why do we all do what we do? I would argue that almost all of us do it because we want to derive meaning on purpose. And science provides us a way to do that. It gives us a path to show value, to give back to our greater society, to solve an important problem. In my area of autism research, to come up with a therapeutic to help families. This is meaning. This is connectedness. That discussion of meaning, the emergence of meaning from your various roles, is emergent properties and coherence. You're taking all of these different things you've done and you're putting them through this wavelength filter to say, okay, I made this choice because of this value. I made that choice because of that value. Taken together, I'm trying to build in X direction. And that X direction is tied to my values and what I derive as meaning. So this is really something that is not just me saying this. So again, going back to Harvard Business Review, they did a study on career complexity, and they found that professionals with experience across 3 or more sectors reported a 30% higher career satisfaction. And so that coherence is not planned. It's often discovered through interaction. So the other flip side of what I'm telling you is take risk. So it may look odd to you if you're a bench scientist and you're scientist 1, 2, and 3 to say, should I take a gamble on that business development job that I think looks kind of interesting, but I'm kind of scared because I'm not sure that I have the skill set? The answer is yes. You should take that gamble because that sector movement is going to build the coherence that you need to derive meaning in your career. All right, so the next thing I want to discuss is how AI comes into all of this. And of course, it is really, much of what I'm saying here is not going to be news to anybody, but I think it's important to just state it as part of our conversation. AI is decreasing the value of isolated expertise. My PhD in neuroscience is relatively useless at this point, and I'm willing to say that because I can go online right now, and of course I have to check for hallucinations. Of course I have to do all the things that you need to do to make sure that AI is giving you the right answers. Set that to the side. Assuming I do all that, I can pretty much regenerate everything I did in my PhD minus what I did in the lab through AI. Now, of course, it's not perfect, and in my world of drug discovery, I'm a little bit of a Luddite in that I feel that AI is still going to bottleneck us when we get to having to test these molecules in clinical populations. That's a whole different story. But let's talk about it in the context of career, because that's the important piece. It is increasing the value of synthesis. And so when you are doing this systems level thinking and applying it to your career, you're demonstrating in real time what you would bring to an organization that knows that they can use AI to streamline every process that you might be able to put on paper. And so your goal is to be able to say, I can demonstrate my synthetic thinking and my ability to take disparate dots and put them together through telling you my story about my own career. That's the best type of demonstration. Of course, you do want to have those bullet points in your resume. I'm not arguing against that. The idea, though, is how do you glue all of that together? And that's really where I think AI is important, because it automates what used to signal expertise: literature searches, data summary, code generation. That's all automated. So the World Economic Forum did some work on this last year, and they even said analytical thinking, creativity, and systems analysis are now topping the list of growing skills, and rote data processing declines pretty fast. And that means that this ability to connect ideas and frame problems and interpret ambiguity is your new competitive advantage. So apply that to your own career, apply that to your own experiences, and then tell that story to future employers. So how can AI actually help you in this systems thinking journey? And so it actually can act as an amplifier, but only if you use it correctly, like all tools. And I think this is where I want to help you all a little bit to think through this. So, of course, it can strengthen our ability to see systems. In my own world, I work at the intersection between CRISPR and brain organoids and autism drug discovery. And I've been thinking a lot about synthetic biology and quantum. And I want to synthesize all of these different areas. Well, no individual is going to be able to do that quickly. AI can do that. At the personal level, you can use that same approach to analyze your own career data. And this is where we're going to get into the career journal, because the career journal isn't something new. But what is interesting is the synthetic, and again, synthesizing here, the synthetic connection between the journal and AI. And we'll come back to that in a minute. At the personal level, you can take your papers, your previous papers, your proposals, notes that you made, observations you've made. You can synthesize all of this to detect recurring themes at the systems level. And so this can act as a form of pattern recognition. And that's really important, because I think one of the things we are challenged with in the linear way that we're trained to do work is the idea to recognize patterns across the larger arc of our career. And I think this is where AI can come in. But here's where I think it's really important to make, this is what I really think is the big takeaway. You can't get any of this out of AI with the approach I'm about to show you unless you use what are called metacognitive approaches to prompt AI. And so, like, what is metacognition? Well, simply stated, it's thinking about your thinking. And so metacognition is the ability to step back and say, why did I think that? Why did I do that? What are the thought processes that led me to that? What does that mean? It means that AI has to have a really good understanding of what your cognitive process is, which means you have to have a really good understanding of what your cognitive processes are, which comes back to my statement of know thyself. If you can put all of that information and use metacognitive prompts with AI into AI with what I'm about to show you, you've got a really powerful tool to get you along in your career into the positions that I think that you might want to have. And so I think it's very useful. I'll also say that regardless of career, because I'm talking about career as if it's somehow separated magically from the rest of our lives, and it is not. A career is an extension of our own psychology and values. This exercise can actually help you as well learn more about yourself, what your values are. So it's not simply, I want to get another job, but it can also help you learn about yourself, which, again, to come back to my thinking, my systems thinking model, that's recursive, because the more you know about yourself and the more you can articulate that, the better jobs you can get that are more aligned with your values, needs, and wants. And that is really what we're talking about when we're talking about career and systems thinking. Okay, so what does that actually mean? So this is the career journal, and this is something I use all the time. In fact, I do a lot of drawing in it more than writing at this point. I mean, I have a Venn diagram that I just drew a couple of years ago that led me to the National Academy of Sciences. So what do you do in that career journal? So you are recording fragments, you're observing patterns, you're adjusting connections. So what does that actually mean? This allows you to practice systems thinking daily. So each week, so you record pieces of your work, but not here's what I did. More, here's what I liked. Here's what I didn't like. I met with a colleague and they presented this data in a certain way, and I really got excited about it. I met with a friend for lunch, and they were complaining about a process, and it really turned me off. These emotional cues are something that you'd write in a regular journal. You want to write in a career journal. So you also want to put in there ideas, decisions. My Venn diagram, for example, that I drew a couple years ago was, what does my career look like right now? Well, what's important to me? It is a intersection between national policy. I still wanted to do basic bench science. How does that happen? And then, of course, service to the nation as a scientist. So how do you do that? I mean, those are really big areas. And that led me to coming up with a plan for how I was going to approach jobs I was going to take, questions I was going to ask, and where I wanted to go. That came from a journal. So every few months you come back and you think about this. Think about what you need in terms of mentoring. What do you need in terms of the scientific work you do? And this, again, not me just saying this. The Wellcome Trust did a survey on researcher well-being, and they found that reflective documentation lowered stress because it had a higher clarity of purpose for the user. And so that career journal operationalizes all the emotional pieces of what we do. And I think that's very important as a scientist. And it turns your experience into analyzable data. Then you can then come back and use AI, sorry about the pause here, to then build awareness and build coherence. So what do? That journal produces awareness of patterns. It produces language that you might like, what kind of language you use to describe how you think about something. You can describe your system of thinking, for example, to employers or funders who value impact. It shows evidence. You can put literal evidence in there. I did this. You know, what was the outcome? You know, so for example, recruiters often look for professionals who can demonstrate this integrative reasoning. Well, the integrative reasoning requires the awareness of patterns, the outcomes for translation, and then the evidence of coherence. You can write that all in a notebook in a really fast way. It doesn't have to be systematized. And then you can then put that back into AI and start thinking about a cross-disciplinary narrative. And why do I care about cross-disciplinary narrative? Well, there's a 2024 Nature's Career Poll that found that 61% of hiring managers in life sciences value cross-disciplinary narrative ability more than technical depth alone. So you need to have this ability to do cross-cutting work and to do technical work. I would argue to most people on this call and in this room that you have the technical down. That's why you do what you do. The question is, how do you build the narrative that shows that cross-disciplinary, cross-cutting work? And that's where AI can come in. So AI synthesis and feedback, now I'm actually going to use the pen. AI synthesis and feedback is really the important piece of this, not the career journal in itself and not AI in itself, but it's the putting together of both of those that can give you that powerful opportunity for self-reflection and then dialogue building. All right, so last couple slides here. I just want to review what the system mindset is so you can see it. So it's seeing things, it's recognizing patterns and shifting in your career. It's connecting those. So it's building relationships and networks, which I know is very hard for many of us, myself included. I guess you just have to use the Nike slogan, which is just do it. You just got to do it. It's really hard. It's awkward for everybody. Just assume the best and do your best. Reflect and analyze your experience. This is really what we just talked about. And not just what I did, but why I did what I did. What are the emotional currencies involved in that? That's really an important piece. And then be able to adapt. And so you have to be responsive to changes in your career path. So let me give you, I often have to be cheerleader and truth teller in my role currently with the environment that we're in. Many of you are challenged right now in terms of your career, and you're sort of in a position where funding is down. We've got a lot of job losses. We're thinking about what the future of our careers look like. There is nothing wrong with saying to yourself, maybe I step out of science for a while or traditional science for a while and I do something else, so long as you've built it into this system. So it doesn't look on paper like some sort of, hey, I took a detour. It looks like this was a conscious effort for me to expand my horizons to do X or Y. And that's part of what the system thinking allows you to do. It frees you in some ways from the social constraints. I know there's a lot of external social pressure to say, well, if I don't go from scientist to scientist to scientist position, that somehow I've failed in my career. That is out the door. That is what I'm trying to, I think, tell you as well with the system thinking, is that you can't think like that. You have to be really open to doing things that maybe look like on the surface risky and outside of the box for a scientist to do in order to propel yourself in this new era that we're in. So long as that when you come back to something that you're looking for long term, you can say, I took that job, and I'm going to make this, I'm going to use an extreme example because I think it's really illustrative. I worked at that floral shop as a business development associate because I wanted to learn business techniques in a sales environment outside of science so that I could bring those skills back with me when I took this business development role in science. I wanted to learn it with a different type of clientele, with a different type of product, so that I could really challenge myself. That comes out of a systems thinking and job notebook approach. That's what I'm talking about. You can't be afraid to do these things. You cannot be afraid to treat a job like, I'm not going to be there for 10 years. I'm just going to do this for a couple of years to gain A, B, C, D skills, and then I'm coming back to this other thing. You have to think about these things as systems, and that is the systems thinking piece of it. What are the root causes? What are the underlying factors that are leading me to make these decisions? Okay. And I know it's hard. What I'm saying is easy to say and hard to do. So I recognize that, and I want to make sure that you all understand that. And I've seen challenges in my own career because of this, and we can talk about those more frankly later. But those are the tools of a systems thinker. What are the emergent patterns, and what is the story arc of your career? How can you tell a career story that moves from this linear ladder to one that reflects values and understands choices as a synthesis? And you can tell that. Use my example of business development in a floral shop. How are you going to connect that back with business development in pharma? What does that mean? Why would you do something like that? And AI can help you as a thought partner in this new way of thinking, but it will only do so if you prompt it with metacognitive queries based on your own personal narrative. So you are merging emotion with data, and you're trying to synthesize those things together. And yes, I've emphasized emotion a lot because we don't often talk about it as a piece of our scientific journey, and is the fundamental piece. And of course, I'm biased because I'm a neuroscientist. So I think I'll end there. I think that gives you a general sense of what I'm thinking, and I'd love to take some questions and engage in some conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. All right, so now we're kind of getting into the Q&A session of today's Career Catalyst. I'm gonna start Michael off with a question, but you guys can kind of ask your question 2 different ways, dropping it in the chat or using the raise hand function that you see at the bottom with that hand emoji. Michael, so as you kind of talk about, using these career systems, can you talk a little bit more about what experiences or turning point that you had in your career to kind of approach it this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been every single time I've been in this type of forced to do this, it's been because my career has been disrupted by some external force. So what I mean by that, so for example, when I originally went to, and some folks in the stem cell world will laugh at this, when I went from a postdoc staff scientist role, I wanted to start my own research lab, of course, because that's what I had been training to do. So I was doing brain organoid research, and at the time I made a huge mistake. Actually, I was calling them serum-free embryonic bodies, which is technically what they actually are, but they are brain organoids. So anyway, I would go and give these presentations with all this wonderful data on my brain organoids, and people would look at me and go, "What's a brain organoid? We don't need that here. That's pie in the sky. Can you do stuff in mice and rats?" And so I actually didn't get everything I had worked for fell apart. And so I had to think about where I wanted to have my lab. So fast forward, I'm doing my lab work, I'm doing all of that, and everything's fine. I start getting pulled into policy conversations because of the stem cell work. So I gave a presentation in 2014 at a scientific conference on the use of CRISPR in humans, in embryos. And I said, I think it's really important to use CRISPR as a scientist, but we have to really think more deeply about engaging externally, because we may lose folks that are non-scientists, and with the real possibility that we could use CRISPR in embryos. And I got laughed off the stage. I had a whole bunch of eminent scientists sitting in the front row that said it was a straw man argument. We'll never use CRISPR in human embryos. And then 4 years later, we had the CRISPR babies, right? So that forced me to write a book on anticipatory ethics in CRISPR and neuroscience. Why? Because that negative emotional reaction to being rejected caused me to make a change. And so then when I looked back on those things, having to go into a non-traditional academic environment to start my lab because nobody knew what brain organoids were, being laughed at a scientific conference, these negative experiences I could tie together and say, well, part of that is I don't know that I would have fit in an academic lab doing this work because I probably at some point would have gotten bored. And these experiences, these negative experiences have taught me more than the positive ones, and have shaped that systems thinking model.
Yeah. No, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah, sometimes the no's are, a good thing to kind of lead you to your path, or lead you to something else. So as we kind of look at identifying those connections, do you have any other advice for helping people kind of identify that bigger picture, that like more holistic approach?
Yeah, I do actually. It's not just AI. So we talk a lot about AI in this presentation, which I think is important, but I think scientists have a good skill in terms of being able to experiment and take data in and then make pivots. So I actually think that one of my biggest words of advice is to go practice it in real time. So go to different networking events and try to talk about yourself using a systems approach, even if it's crude and it doesn't work out, and watch the reactions of other people. See what questions they ask you. See if they even get what you're talking about. And that gives you real-time data to sort of refine and shape that story. And so I would say AI is one piece. AI sort of sets you up for what that conversation looks like, but then you have to test it in the real world, right? So like when I in my startup hat, put my startup hat on, I'm all about customer discovery, market discovery. I tell folks that postdocs and grad students that train with me, don't come to me with an idea before you've even done any of the market discoveries, because the best ideas sound really good on paper until you test them in the real world. And so if there's no market for that idea, I hate this because I love basic research, but at this day and age, you're just not going to get funding for it. So the same idea with this, right? You got to go out into the real world. Like you and I, Annabelle, I could tell you my story and I could see like whether or not you think like, I could see on your face, like, I don't know if I believe in this guy, or, oh, that's really interesting. Or maybe you ask me something I didn't even think about because you heard something that sparked you. That helps shape that systems thinking and makes that muscle stronger.